Hello. How is my sound? Sound is good. Excellent. Yes. Hopefully not too much background work from the laptop. Sound is goose. Honk. Honk, honk like the vigilant goose. Okay, so once again, and for a short period of time, because I am absolutely wrecked from LARP, I will be reading one of the stories from the Giant Book of Vampires, which you can see both here and here. I will just be doing Melanie Thames' The Better Half, because I haven't got enough energy to do two stories. Right. So, Melanie Thames' first novel, the dark fantasy Prodigal, was published by Abyss in 1991, and her second, Blood Moon, recently appeared from the Women's Press. Her short stories can be found in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, Women of Darkness, Women of the West, Skin of the Soul, Final Shadows, Copper Star, Cold Shocks, Dark Voices 3, The Pan Book of Horror, and Fantasy Tales. Roadkill Press published her story Daddy's Side, that's a name, as a limited edition chapbook, while collaborations with her husband Steve Rasnick Tem recently appeared in The Ultimate Dracula and The Ultimate Frankenstein. The Better Half is one of those vampire stories that takes an oblique look at the theme. It is no less disturbing a piece of fiction for that. Kelly opened the door before I'd even come close to her house. The opening and closing of the red door in the White House startled me like a mouth baring teeth. I stopped where I was, halfway down the block. Kelly was wearing a yellow dress and something white around her shoulders. She stepped farther out onto the porch and shaded her eyes against the high July sun. For some reason, I didn't want her to see me just yet. I stepped behind a thick lilac bush dotted with the hard purplish nubs of spent flowers. A small brown dog in the yard across the street yapped twice at me, and then gave it up and went back to its spot in the shade. I hadn't seen Kelly in 15 years. I thought I'd forgotten her, but I'd have known her anywhere. In college we'd been very close for a while. Now that I was older and more careful, I'd have expected not to understand the ardour I'd felt for her then. It distressed me that I understood it perfectly, even felt a pulse of it again like hot blood. Watching her from a distance and through the purple and green filtering of the lilac bush, I found myself a little afraid of her. Later, I learned that it was not Kelly I had reason to fear. But my father had died in the spring, and I was afraid of everything. Afraid of loving. Afraid of not loving. Afraid of coming home while rounding a corner and discovering something terrible that I, by my presence, could have stopped. I cowered behind the lilac bush and wished I could make myself invisible. I wondered why she'd called. I wondered savagely why I'd come. I thought about retreating along the hot, bright sidewalk away from her house. I could hardly keep myself from rushing headlong to her. Slowly, I approached her. It was obvious that she still hadn't seen me. She was looking the other way. Looking for me. I was purposely a few minutes late. Then she turned, and I knew with a chill that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just that she looked alien, although she was elegantly dressed on a Saturday morning in a neighbourhood where a business suit on a weekday was an oddity. It wasn't just that I felt invaded, although her house was around the corner from the diner where Daddy and I often had breakfast. The park where we'd walk sometimes, the apartment where we'd lived. It was more than that. There was something wrong with her. I stopped again and stared. It was mid-July and high noon. Hot green light through the porch awning flooded her face. The same heavy brows, high cheekbones, and slightly aquiline nose. She looked sick. The spots of colour high on her cheeks could have been paint or fever. She was breathing hard. Even from here I could see that she was shivering violently. And around her shoulders in the noonday summer heat was a white fur jacket. I have told myself that at that point I nearly left, but I don't think that's true. I stood there looking at her across the neat green of the Kentucky bluegrass in her North Denver lawn. Sprinklers were on, making rainbows. I was drawn to her as I'd always been. Something was wrong, and I was about to be drenched in it too. She saw me and smiled, a weak and heart-wrenching grimace. I wished desperately that I had never come, but the impulse towards self-preservation, like others throughout my life, came too late. Brenda! Hello! I opened the waist-high, filigreed wrought-iron gate, turned to latch it carefully behind me, turned again to walk between even rows of pinwheel petunias. Kelly, I said, with an effort holding out my hand. It's good to see you. Her hand was icy cold. I still vividly recall the shock of touching it, the momentary disorientation of having to remind myself that the temperature was nearly 100 degrees. She leaned towards me over the porch railing, and a tiny hot breeze stirred the half-dozen wind chimes that hung from the eave, making a sweet cacophony. Healthy plants hung thick around her, almost obscuring her face. I could smell both her honeysuckle perfume and the faint sickly odour of her breath. She was smiling cordially. Her lips were pale pink, almost colourless, against the yellow white of her teeth. There were dark circles under her eyes. For a moment I had the terrifying fantasy that she would tumble off the porch into my arms, and that when she hit, she would weigh no more than the truncated melodies from the sway of the chimes. Her voice was much as I'd remembered it. Husky, controlled, well modulated. But I thought I'd heard it break, as though the 2 words she'd spoken would be almost too much for her. She took a deep breath, encircled my wrist with thin, icy fingers of her other hand, and said, Come in. I had last seen Kelly at her wedding. I'd watched the ceremony from a gauzy distance, wondering how she could bring herself to do such a thing, and whether I'd ever get the chance. My father had already been sick, and my mother, of course, long gone. Then I had passed through a long reception line to have her press my hand and kiss my cheek as though she'd never seen me before. Or never would again. Ron, her new husband, had bent to kiss me too, and I'd made a point to cough at the silly musk of his aftershave. He was tall and very fair, with baby-soft stubble on his cheeks and upper lip. His big, paw-like hands cupped my shoulders as he gazed earnestly down at me. I love her, Brenda. He could have been reciting the Boy Scout pledge. Already she's my better half. Later, I repeated that comment to my friends. We all laughed and rolled our eyes. Ron was always terribly sincere. He could be making an offhand remark about the weather or the cafeteria food, and from his tone and delivery you'd think he was issuing a proclamation to limit worldwide nuclear arms proliferation. Ron was simple. Often you could tell he'd missed the punchline of a joke, especially if it was off-colour. He'd chuckle good-naturedly anyway. He had a hard time keeping up with our rapid Eastern chatter, and he'd look from one speaker to the next like an alert puppy, as if he were following right along. He was such an easy target that few of us resisted the temptation to make fun of him. Kelly, who was brilliant, got him through school. At first she literally wrote his papers for him. He was a poli-sci major, and she took languages, so it meant double studying for her, but she didn't seem to pull any more all-nighters than the rest of us. Gradually, he'd learned to write first drafts, which she then edited meticulously. You'd see them huddled at a table in the library, Kelly looking grim and Ron looking earnest and genial and bewildered. She taught him everything. How to write a simple sentence, how to study for an exam. How to read a paragraph from beginning to end and catch the drift. How to eat without grossing everybody out. How to behave during fraternity rush. At a time when the entire Greek system was the object of much derision on our liberal little campus, Ron became a proud and busy Delt. Senior year he was elected president, and Kelly, demure in gold chiffon, clung to his arm. We gossiped that she taught him everything he knew about sex, too. That first year, before the mores and the rules loosened to allow men and women in each other's rooms, everybody made out in the courtyard of the freshman women's dorm. Because Kelly said they had too much work to do, they weren't there as often as some of the rest of us. For a while that winter and spring, I spent most of my waking hours and a few asleep in the courtyard with a handsome and knowledgeable young man from New Jersey named Jan. But Ron and Kelly were there often enough for us to observe them and comment on their form. His back would be hard against the wall and his arms stiffly down around her waist. She'd be stretched up to nuzzle in his neck, or, we speculated unkindly, to whisper instructions. At first, if you said hello on your way past, we would, just to be perverse. Ron's innate politeness would have him nodding and passing the time of day. Kelly didn't acknowledge anything but Ron. She was totally absorbed in him. Before long, he had also learned to ignore us, or seemed to. Kelly was moody, intense, determined. Absolutely focused. I knew her before she met Ron. They assigned us as roommates freshman year. There was something about her, besides our age, the sense that we were standing on a frontier, that made me tell her things. I hadn't told anybody. Hadn't even thought of before, and made me listen to her self-revelations with bated breath, as though I were witness to the birth of fine music, or ferreting out the inkling of a mystery. In those days, Kelly was already fascinated by women who had died for something they believed in, like Joan of Arc, about whom she read in lyrical French, or for something they were and couldn't help, like Anne Frank, whose diary she read in deceptively robust German. I didn't understand the words. I was a sociology major, but I knew the stories, and I loved the way Kelly looked and sounded when she read. When she stopped, there would be a rapturous silence, and then one or both of us would breathe, "Oh, that was beautiful." After she met Ron, things between Kelly and me changed. At first, all she talked about was him, and I quite understood that. I talked about Jan lots, too. But gradually she quit talking to me at all, and when she listened it was politely, her pen poised over the essay whose editing I'd interrupted. Ron seemed as open and expansive and featureless as the prairies of his native Nebraska. I was convinced she was wasting her life. He wasn't good enough for her. I could not imagine what she saw in him. Unless it was the limited opportunity to play puppeteer, sculptor, inventor. I said that to her one night when we were both lying awake, trying not to be disturbed by the party down the hall. She was my best friend, and I thought I owed it to her to tell her what I thought. "What is it between you and Ron, anyway?" I demanded somewhat abruptly. We'd been complaining desultorily to each other about the noise, and making derogatory comments about some people's study habits, and in my own ears I suddenly sounded angry and hurt, which was not what I'd intended. But I went on anyway. "What is this, a role-reverse Pygmalion, or what?" She was silent for such a long time that I thought either she'd fallen asleep or she was completely ignoring me this time. I was just about to pose my challenge again, maybe even get out of the bed and cross the room, and shake her by the shoulders until she paid attention to me, when she answered calmly, "There are worse things." "Kelly, you're beautiful and brilliant. You could have any man on this campus. Ron is just so ordinary." "Ron is good for me, Brenda. I don't expect you to understand." But then she assuaged my hurt feelings by trying to explain. "He takes me out of myself." That was the last time Kelly and I talked about anything important. It was practically the last time we talked at all. For the rest of freshman year I might have had a single room, except for intimate, hurtful evidence of her. Stockings hung like empty skin on the closet doorknob to dry, bottles of perfume and makeup like a string of amulets across her nightstand. All of it carefully on her side of the room. The next year she roomed with a sorority sister, somebody whom I didn't know, and whom I didn't think Kelly knew very well either. I was surprised and a little offended to get a wedding invitation. I told myself I had no obligation to go. I went anyway and cried and pressed her hand. To this day, I'm not sure she knew who I was when I went through the reception line. I spent most of the reception making conversation with Kelly's parents, a gaunt, pale woman who looked very much like Kelly, and a tall, fair, robust man. They were proud of their daughter. Ron was a fine young man who would go far in the world. Her father was jocular and verbose. He danced with all the young women, several times with me. Her mother barely said a word, seldom got out of her chair. Her smile was like the winter sun. At the time, I didn't know that I'd noticed all that about Kelly's parents. I hadn't thought about them in years, probably had never thought about them directly. But the impressions were all there, ready for the taking. If I'd just paid attention, I might have been warned. And then, I don't know what I would have done. Since college, Kelly and I had barely kept in touch. For a while, I had kept approximate track of her through mutual friends and the alumni newsletter. I moved out west because the dry climate might be better for Daddy's health, got a graduate degree in planning and a job with the Aurora City government. Left Daddy alone too much, then hired a stranger to nurse him so I could live my own life, as if there was such a thing. From sporadic Christmas cards, I knew Kelly and her family lived in various parts of Europe. Ron was an attorney specialising in international law and a high-ranking officer in the military. And his job had something to do with intelligence? Maybe the CIA. I knew that they had 2 sons. In every communication, no matter how brief, Kelly mentioned that she had never worked a day outside the home, that when Ron was away she sometimes went for days without talking to an adult, that her languages were getting rusty except for the language of the country she happened to be living in at the time. It seemed to me that even her English was awkward, childlike, although it was hard to tell from the few sentences she wrote. Last year I'd received a copy of a form Christmas letter run off on pale green paper with wreaths along the margin. Yes, probably a vampire family. Ostensibly composed by Ron. It was so eloquent and interesting, grammatically sophisticated, that at first I was a little shocked. Then I decided with distaste, but also with a measure of relief that should have been a clue if I'd been paying attention, that Kelly must still be ghostwriting. For some reason I'd kept that letter, although as far as I could remember I hadn't answered it. After Kelly's call I'd pulled it out and reread it. The letter described the family's travels in the Alps, although it read like a travel brochure. The prose was competent and there were vivid images. It outlined the boys' many activities and commented, "Without Kelly, of course, none of this would be possible." It mentioned that Kelly had been ill lately, tired. The wet grey winters of Northern Europe really don't agree with her. We're hoping that some of her sparkle will return when we move back home. I thought there was nothing insignificant in that slick, chatty green-edged letter. I'd been wrong. Kelly's house was very orderly and close and clean. She led me down a short hallway lined with murky photographs of people I didn't think I knew, into a living room where a fire crackled in a plain brick fireplace, and not a speck of ash marred the dappled marble surface of the hearth. Heavy maroon drapes were pulled shut, floor to ceiling, and all the lights were on. The room was stifling. Startled and confused, I paused in the arched doorway while Kelly went on ahead of me. I saw her pull her white fur jacket closer around her as if she were cold. "We haven't lived here very long," she said over her shoulder. She was apologising, but I didn't know what for. "It's nice," I said, and followed her into the night-like, winter-like room. She gestured towards a rocker recliner. "Make yourself at home." I sat down. Though the chair was across the room, the part of my body which faced the fire grew hot in a matter of seconds, and I had started to sweat. Kelly pulled an ottoman nearly onto the hearth and huddled onto it, hugging her knees. I was quickly discomfited by the silence between us, through which I could hear her laboured breathing and the spitting of the fire. "How long have you lived here?" I asked, to have something to say. "Just a few months, since the 1st of April. So she knew it was summer. "How long will you be here?" I knew it was sounding like an interrogation, but I desperately needed to ground myself in time and space. That was not a new impulse, though I hadn't been so acutely aware of it before. I was shaking, and the heat was making my head swim. It seemed to me that I had been floating for a long time. I understand now, of course, how misguided it was to look to Kelly for ballast. She had almost no weight herself by that time, no substance of her own, so she couldn't have held anybody down. Abruptly, as often happened to me when I was invaded by even a hint of strong emotion, fear, pleasure, grief, I could feel the slight weight of my father's body in my arms and the web of his baby fine hair across my lips. I closed my eyes against the pain and curled my arms into my chest as though to keep from dropping him. Almost tonelessly, Kelly asked, "What's wrong, Brenda?" And I realised I'd covered my face with my empty hands. "You remind me of somebody," I said. That surprised me. She wasn't even sure what it meant. Self-stimulating like an autistic child, I was rocking furiously in the cumbersome chair. I forced myself to press my palms flat against its knubby arms, stopping the motion. "Somebody else who left me," I added. She didn't ask me what I meant. She didn't defend against my interpretation of what had happened between us. She just cocked her head in a quizzical gesture so familiar to me that I caught my breath, although I wouldn't have guessed that I remembered anything significant about her. Absently, she picked 2 bits of lint off the brown carpet, which had looked spotless to me, and deposited them into her other palm, closing her fingers protectively. I noticed her silver pink nails. I noticed that her mauve stockings were opaque, thicker than standard nylons, and that the stylish high-heeled boots she wore were fair-lined. I wanted to go sit beside her, have her hug me to warm us both. I was sweating profusely. I think I was on the verge of telling her about my father. I think I might have said things to her that I hadn't yet said to myself. I'm still haunted by the suspicion that if I'd spoken up at that moment, subsequent events might have turned out very differently. The thought makes my blood run cold. But I didn't say anything, for that moment Kelly's sons came home. I flinched as I heard a screen door slam, heard children's voices laughing and squabbling. It was as if their liveliness tore at something. Daddy died while I was out. He hadn't wanted me to go, though he would never have said so. He hadn't liked the man, any man, I was with. When I came home, earlier than I'd intended, though not early enough, determined not to see that man again, I'd found my father dead on the floor. If I'd been there, I could have saved him, or at least held him while he died. I owed him. He gave me life. Struggling to stay in focus when the boys burst in, I kept my eyes on Kelly. The transformation was remarkable. Many times after that I saw it happen to her, and I was always astounded. But that first time was like witnessing a miracle or the results of a spectacular compact with the devil. Excuse me. She filled out like an inflatable doll. Colour flooded into her cheeks. Her shoulders squared and she sat up straight. By the time her boys found us and rushed into the living room, bringing with them, like sirens, their light and fresh air and energy, she was holding out her arms to them and beaming, and the white fur jacket had slipped from her shoulders onto the hearth behind her, where I thought it might burn. I stayed at Kelly's house for a long time that first day, though I hadn't intended to. When Kelly introduced me as an old friend from college, Joshua, the younger child, stared at me solemn-eyed and demanded, "You know my daddy too?" I admitted that I did, or used to. He nodded. He was very serious. We had a picnic lunch outside on the patio. I watched the children splash in the sprinkler and bounce on the backyard trampoline, watched Kelly bask like a chameleon in the sunshine. She was a nervous hostess. She fluttered and fussed to make sure the boys and I were served, persistently inquired whether the lemonade was sweet enough and whether the sandwiches had too much mayonnaise. Was visibly worried when any of us stopped eating. She herself didn't eat at all, as if she wasn't entitled to. She didn't swat at flies or fan herself or complain about the heat. She hardly talked to me. Her interactions with the children were impatient. She watched us eat and play, and the look on her face was near panic, as if she couldn't be sure she was getting it right. I was restless. I wasn't used to sitting still for so long without something to occupy me. Television, a newspaper, knitting. At one point I got up and went to join the boys. I tossed the new yellow frisbee, spotted Clay on the tramp, squirted Joshua with the sprinkler. I was clumsy and they didn't like it. My intrusion altered the rhythms of their play. "Quit it!" Josh shrieked when the water hit him, and Clay simply slid off the end of the trampoline and stalked away when he discovered I'd taken up position at the side. Yeah, I guess. It's always unusual when you don't have any kids and you try to play with kids and you're not playing with the right way and they get annoyed with you and they can't articulate why, and it's just that you're not used to how they play. Somewhat aimlessly, I strolled around the yard. Red and salmon late roses climbed the privacy fence. I touched their petals and thorns bent to sniff their fragrance. "Ron likes roses," Kelly said from behind me, and I jumped. I hadn't realised how close she was, and that's why we planted all those bushes. They're hard to take care of, though. I'm still learning. Ron buys me books. "They're beautiful," I said. "They're a lot of care, and he's never here to do any of it. It's part of my job." Clay appeared at my elbow. He was carrying a framed and glass-covered portrait big enough that he had to hold it with both hands. "Clay," his mother remonstrated, much more sharply than I'd have expected from her. "Don't drop that." "I'll put it back," he said, lightly dismissing her. "See," he said earnestly to me. "That's my dad." Oh, it still happens if they are your child. Oh well, nice to know not just me then. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. What acknowledgements would be satisfactory? I looked at him, at his brother across the yard, at the portrait. It had been taken 7 years ago, and the boys looked much younger. Kelly was pale and lovely, clinging to her husband's arm, even though the photographer had no doubt posed her standing up straight. The uniformed man at the hub of the family grouping was taller, ruddier, and possessed of much more presence than I remembered. "You look like him," I finally said to Clay. "You both do." He grinned and nodded and took the heavy picture back into the house. I sat on the kid's swing and watched a grey bird sitting in the apple tree. It was the wrong time of the season between blossom and fruit to tell whether there would be a good crop. I wondered idly whether Kelly made applesauce and whether Ron and the boys liked apple pie. "My dad put up those swings for us," Joshua shouted from the wading pool, sounding angry. I took the lemonade pitcher inside for more ice, although no one lived there had suggested it. Being alone in Kelly's kitchen gave me a sense of just-missed intimacy. I guessed that she spent a good deal of time here, cooking and cleaning, but there seemed to be nothing personal about her in the room. I looked around. The pictures on the wall above the microwave were standard square. Factory-painted representations of vegetables, a tomato, a carrot, and an ear of corn. Pleasant enough. On the single-shelf spice rack above the dishwasher were 2 red and white cans and two undistinguished glass bottles. Cinnamon, onion powder, salt, and pepper. Nothing idiosyncratic or identifying. No dishes soaked in the sink. No meat was thawing on the counter for dinner. I remember thinking that if I looked through the cupboards and drawers and into the back shelves of the refrigerator, I'd surely find something about Kelly, but I couldn't quite bring myself to make such a deliberate search. Now, of course, I know that there wouldn't have been anything anyway, but no favourite snacks of hers secreted away. No dishes that meant anything special to her. No special recipes. In the freezer, I'd probably have found fudgesicles for Clay and Eskimo pies for Josh, and No doubt there was a six-pack of Coors Light on the top shelf of the refrigerator for Ron. But no matter how deeply I looked or how broadly I interpreted, I wouldn't have found anything personal about Kelly, except in what she'd made sure there was there for others. I set the picture on the counter and moved so that I was standing in the middle of the floor with my hands at my sides and my eyes closed. I held my breath. It was like being trapped in a flotation tank. I could hear the boys squealing and shouting outside, the hum of a lawnmower farther away, and the ticking of a clock nearby, but the sounds of outside were outside of me, not touching. I could smell whiffs and layers of homey kitchen odours, coffee, cinnamon, onions, but I'd never been fed in this room. I opened my eyes and was dizzy. Without knowing it, I had turned so that now I was facing a little alcove that opened off the main kitchen. A breakfast nook, maybe, or a pantry. I rounded the multicoloured plexiglass partition and caught my breath. The place was a shrine. On all three walls, from the waist-high wainscoting nearly to the ceiling, were photographs of Ron and Clay and Joshua. Black and white photos on a plain white background, unlike the busy kitchen wallpaper in the rest of the room. Pictures of them singly and in various combinations. Ron in uniform looking stoic and sensible, Clay doing a flip on the trampoline, Joshua in his Cub Scout uniform, the three of them in a formal pose, each boy with his hand on his father's shoulder. The boys by a Christmas tree. I counted, there were 43 photographs. I couldn't bring myself to go into the alcove. I think I was afraid I'd hear voices. There was not a single likeness of Kelly anywhere in the open white walls. Later, a grim and wonderful thought occurred to me. It would have been virtually impossible for a detective to find out anything useful about Kelly, or for a voodoo practitioner to fashion an efficacious doll. There was little essence of hair left. There were few details. By the end, it would have been easy to say that she had no soul. For the rest of that summer and into the fall, I spent a great deal of time at Kelly's house. It started with lunch on Saturdays, always a picnic lunch with the boys on the patio, sandwiches and lemonade and chips. But she never let me bring anything. She seemed to take offence when I tried to insist. "Why don't you and I go somewhere for lunch, Kelly? Get a sitter for the boys or take them to the pool or something." "The pool isn't safe. I don't like the kind of kids who go there." Kelly and I never seemed to be alone together. Her sons were always there in the same room or within earshot or about to rush in and demand something of her. I chafed. I didn't much like the boys anyway. I found them mouthy and rude to me, but especially to their mother, and altogether too high-spirited for my tastes. "It's nice to see a mother spend as much time with her kids as you do," I said once, lying and trying to understand, trying to get her to talk to me about something. "We've always been close," she said a little hesitantly. "They both nursed until they were almost 2. Sometimes Josh will still try to nib at my breast, in play, you know." A little taken aback, I said, "You seem to enjoy their company." I didn't know whether that was true or not. She shrugged and laughed a little. "I think I've inherited my father's attitude toward children. They'd be fine if you could teach them and train them and mould them into what you want. Otherwise, they're mostly irritating." She laughed again and shivered, hugged herself, passed a hand over her eyes. "But I don't have to like my kids in order to be a good mother, do I?" For a long time I didn't see Ron. He was always at work when I was there, and no matter how late I stayed. He worked later. "Come with me to see this movie. I've been wanting to see it for a long time, and it's about to leave town, and I don't want to go alone. There's a movie the boys want to see, one of those kung fu things. I promised to take them this weekend." Kelly's roses faded, and the marigolds and petunias and then chrysanthemums came into their own. It is a good question. Not one I can answer, I'm afraid. The apple tree bore nicely tiny fruit, clustered all on the south side of the tree because, Kelly speculated, the bottoms on the north side had been frozen early in the spring. That distressed her enormously. Her eyes shone with tears when she talked about it. The boys went back to school. "Now you have lots of free time. Let's go to the art museum one morning next week, and I can take a few hours off." "Oh, Brenda, the work around here is endless. Really, I have full house cleaning to do. I'm redecorating Clay's room. There must be a dozen layers of wallpaper on those walls. My first responsibility is to run and the children. You're welcome to come here, though. I could fix you lunch." This is interesting. This is how I always lose friends when they have kids. Like, they just don't have time for anything else. And it's darkly realistic, but also creepy and supernatural. Like, One crisp Wednesday in late September, I had a meeting over on her side of town, and I didn't have to be back at the office until my 2 o'clock staff meeting. Impulsively, I turned off onto a side street toward her house. I'd never been to Kelly's house on a weekday before. I'd never dropped in on her unexpectedly. I had seldom dropped in on anybody unexpectedly. I liked to have time to prepare, and was keenly aware of the differences between people in private and people when they met the world, even the small and confused part of the world represented by me. My heart was skittering uneasily, and I felt a little feverish and chilled, though the sun was warm and the sky brilliant. The houses and trees and fence rows along these old blocks had taken on that sharp-edged quality that autumn sometimes imparts to a city. Every brick seemed outlined, and every flower and leaf a jewel. I parked by the side of her house across the street. I opened and shut the gate as quietly as I could. I stood for a while on her porch listening to the wind chimes, catching stray rainbows from the lopsided paper leaf Josh had made in school and hung in the front window. She had moved the plants inside for the winter, and the porch seemed bare. Finally, I pushed the button for the doorbell and waited. A few cars went by behind me. I touched the doorbell button again, listened for any sound inside the house, but could hear none. When I tried the door, it opened easily. I went in quickly and shut the door behind me, thinking to keep out the light and dust. I was nearly through the front hall into the kitchen before I called her name. "In here, Brenda," she answered, as though she'd been expecting me. I stopped for a moment, bewildered. Maybe I'd somehow forgotten that I'd called ahead, or maybe we'd had plans for today that I hadn't written in my appointment book. "Where?" "In here." I found her finally in the master bedroom. She was in bed under the covers. She wore a scarf and a stocking cap on her head, mittens on the hands that had pulled the covers up to her chin. Around her neck I could see the collar of the white fur jacket. Her teeth were chattering, and her skin was so pale that it was almost green. I stood in the window and stared. The shaft of light through the blinded window looked wintry. "Kelly, what's wrong? Are you sick?" It was a question I could have asked months before, and now it seemed impossible to avoid. "I'm cold," she said weakly. "I don't seem to have any energy. Should I call somebody?" "No, it's all right. Usually if I stay in bed all day, I'm right by the time the boys get home from school." "How often does this happen?" "Oh, I don't know. Every other day or so now, I guess." I had advanced into the room, stood by the side of the bed. I was reluctant to touch her. I now know that the contagion had nothing to do with physical contact with Kelly, that I was safer alone in that house with her than I have ever been at any time since. But that morning all I knew was cold fear and alarm for my friend, and intense, exhilarating curiosity. "Where's Ron?" I demanded. "Is he still out of town? Does he know about this?" "He came home late last night," she told me, and I had no way of appreciating the significance of what she'd said. "What should I do? Should I call him at work? Or call a doctor?" "No." With a great sigh and much tremulous effort, she lifted her feet over the side of the bed and sat up. I could feel her dizziness. I put my hand flat against the wall and lowered my head to let it clear. Kelly stood up. "Take me out somewhere," she said. "I'm hungry. Let's go to lunch." Without my help, she made it out of the house, down the walk, and into the car. The sun had been shining in the passenger window, so it could be warm for her there. There was definitely a fall chill to the air, I decided, as I found myself shivering a little. "Where do you want to go?" I asked her. "Someplace fast." In Denver, I have always been delighted personally and professionally by contrasts, one of which is the proximity of quiet residential neighbourhoods like Kelly's to bustling commercial strips. We were 5 minutes from half a dozen fast food places. Kelly said she didn't care which one, so I drove somewhat randomly and found the one with the least crowded parking lot. She wanted to go inside. The place was warm, bright, and cacophonous. I saw Kelly wrap herself more tightly in the fur jacket, saw people glance at her and then glance away. She went to find a seat as far away from the windows and doors as she could, and I ordered for both of us, not knowing what she wanted, taking a chance. There was a very long line. When I finally got to her, she was staring with a stricken look on her face at the middle-aged woman in the ridiculous uniform who was clearing the tables and sweeping the floor. "I talked to her," Kelly whispered as I set the laden tray down. "She has a master's degree." "In what?" I asked, making conversation. It seemed important to keep her engaged, so I didn't know what she was talking about. "Here's your shake. I hope chocolate's all right. They were out of strawberry." When she didn't answer right away, I looked at her more closely. The expression of horror on her face made my stomach turn. Her eyes were bloodshot and bulging. She was breathing heavily through her mouth. Her gloved hands on the tabletop were clawed as if trying to find in the formica something to cling to. "That could be me a few years from now," she said hoarsely. "Working in a fast food place for a little extra money and something to do? Alone? That could be me." "Don't be silly," I snapped. "You have a lot more going for you than that woman does." Suddenly she was shrieking at me. "How do you know that? How can you know? I've let everybody down. Everybody. All my teachers and professors who said I had so much potential. My father. Everybody. You don't know what you're talking about." And then to my own horror, she struggled to her feet and hobbled out of the door. For a moment I really thought she'd disappeared, vanished somehow into the air that wasn't much thinner than she was. I told myself that was crazy and followed her. The lunchtime crowd had filled in behind Kelly and was all of a piece again. I pushed through it and through the door, which framed the busy street scene as if it were a poor photograph. Flat and without meaning to me until I entered it. I looked around. Kelly had collapsed on the hot sidewalk against the building. Her knees were drawn up, her head was down so that the stringy dark hair fell over her face and the collar of the jacket stood up around her ears. Two women in shorts and halter tops crouched beside her. I hurried as though to save her from them, although of course by then Kelly wasn't the one that needed protecting. I met Ron at the hospital. From the ambulance stretcher, in a flat, high voice that seemed almost to be part of the siren, Kelly had told me how to reach him. I hadn't wanted to. I hadn't wanted him with us. By the time he made it through all the layers and synapses of the bureaucracy he works in, and I heard his official voice on the other end of the line, I was furious. But I hadn't missed anything. Kelly was still waiting in the emergency room, slumped in a chair. Ron did not sound specially alarmed. I told myself it was his training. He said he'd be there in 15 minutes, and he was. They had just taken Kelly to be examined when he got there. I was standing at the counter looking after her, feeling bereft. They wouldn't let me go back to behind the curtain with her, and she was too weak to ask for me. When the tall, blonde uniformed man strode by me, I didn't try to speak to him, and no one else did either. I doubt that Kelly asked for him or gave permission or even recognised him when he came. None of that was necessary. He was her husband. She was part of him. He had the right. My father and I had been bound like that too. If I'd asserted the right to be part of him, welcomed and treasured it, I could have been. Instead, I thought it was necessary for me to grow up, to separate. And so I'd lost him. Lost us both, I thought then, for without him I had no idea who I was. I felt Ron's presence approaching me before I opened my eyes and saw him. She's unconscious, he said. They don't know yet what's wrong. You don't look very good at yourself. Come and sit down. I didn't let him touch me then, but I preceded him to a pair of orange plastic bucket chairs attached to a metal bar against the wall. We were then sitting squarely side by side and the chairs didn't move. I did make the effort to face him. He was friendly and solemn as befitted the occasion. He took my hand in both of his, swallowing it. Brenda, he said. He made my name sound far more significant than I'd ever thought it was, and despite myself, despite the circumstances, and despite what I've mistakenly called my better judgment, something inside me stirred gratefully. It's nice to see you again after all these years. I'm sorry our reunion turned out to be like this. Kelly has talked a great deal about you over the past few months. I nodded. I didn't know what to say. What happened? Ron asked. He let go of my hand and it was cold. I put both hands in my pockets. She collapsed? I told him. The more I told him, the angrier I became, and the closer to the kind of emptying, racking sobs I'd been so afraid of. Now I know there's nothing to fear in being emptied. Kelly simply hadn't taken it far enough. To the end, some part of her fought it. I don't fight at all anymore. What do you mean? Tell me what happened. The details. He was moving in, assuming command. It crossed my mind to resist it, but for the instant he'd walked into the room, I'd felt exhausted. I dropped by to see her. I was in the neighbourhood. So when I got there, she was sick. She asked me to take her out to lunch, so we... Out? His blonde eyebrows rose, then furrowed disapprovingly. Out of the house? With you? I mustered a little indignation. What's wrong with that? It's unusual, that's all. Just go on. I told him the rest of what I knew. It seemed to take an enormous amount of time to say it all, though I wouldn't have thought I had that much to say. I stumbled over words. There were long silences. Ron listened attentively. At one point he rested his hand on my shoulder in a comradely way, and I was too tired and disorientated to roll free. When I finished, he nodded, and then someone came for him behind the curtain and lights, and I was left alone again, knowing I hadn't said enough. Kelly never came home from the hospital. She died without regaining consciousness. Many times since then... Hi, Pri. I'm afraid I'm on the last section of it, so... but to be honest, I could probably manage the next story as well. Because I don't think it's that long. Yeah, it's not that long. So I'm not too tired, so I can do the next one as well. Kelly never came home from the hospital. She died without regaining consciousness. Many times since then, I've wondered what she would have said to me if she'd awakened. What advice she would have given. Don't worry, no worries. What warning and how she would have passed the torch? I wasn't there when she died, but Ron was. He called me early the next morning to tell me. He sounded drained. His voice was flat and thin. "Oh, Ron," I said foolishly, and then I waited for him to tell me what to do. "I'd like you to come over," he said. "The boys are having a hard time." I haven't left since. I haven't been back to my apartment even to pick up my things. None of my former possessions seems worth retrieval. I had no animals to feed, no plants to water, no books or clothes or furniture or photographs that mean anything to me now. Kelly kept her house orderly. From the first day I could find things. The boys' schedules were predictable, although very busy. Names and phone numbers of their friends' parents, scout leaders, piano teachers were on a laminated list on the kitchen bulletin board. In her half of the master bedroom closet, I found clothes of various sizes, and the larger ones from before she lost so much weight fit fine. The first week I took personal leave from work. Since then I've been calling in sick when I think of it. Most recently, I haven't called in at all, and of course they don't know where I am. Ron is away a good deal. The work he does is important and mysterious. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm proud to be able to help him do it. But he was home that first week and we got used to each other. You're very different from the man I knew in college, I told him. We were sitting in the darkened living room. We'd been talking about Kelly. We'd both been crying. He was sitting beside me on the couch. I saw him nod and slightly smile. Kelly used to say I'd developed my potential beyond her wildest dreams, he admitted, and she'd lost hers. I felt a flash of anger against her. She was dead. She had a choice, I pointed out. Nobody forced her to do anything. She could have done other things with her life. Definitely run away. Yeah. Don't be too sure of that, he said sharply. His tone surprised and hurt me. I glanced at him through the shadows, saw him lean forward to set his drink on the coffee table. He took my empty glass from my hands and put it down too, then swiftly lowered his face to my neck. There was a small pain, and afterwards a small stinging wound. When he was finished, he stood up, wiped his mouth with his breast pocket handkerchief, and went upstairs to bed. I sat up for a long time, amazed, touched, frightened. No longer lonely, no longer having decisions to be made or protection to construct. That first night, that first time, I did not feel tired or cold. The sickness has since begun, but the exhilaration has heightened too. Ron says he loves me. He says he and the boys need me and couldn't get along without me. I like to hear that. I know what he means. It is super creepy. I think that's one of the creepiest ones in the book entirely, to be honest. Even creepier than like the overtly horrifying ones. Or the BDSM nightmare one. Okay, I haven't pre-prepared the content warnings for this one, so I'll just read them out. So this one is an episode of Cathedral History, and it's by M.R.James, the wonderful M.R.James, author of Count Magnus, of course, which I have done on this channel before. The what now? So the content warnings for this are alcohol, death or dying, illness, nightmares, supernatural threat, and violence. So, Montague Rhodes James, 1862 to 1936, is widely regarded as the author of some of the most alarming and unforgettable ghost stories in the English language. Death or dying. Yeah, I imagine that previous story hits differently if you actually have kids or a family. Like, for me, it's just like, there, but for the grace of God go I. But, yeah. As a serious child, he developed a lifelong interest in medieval books and antiques at an early age. He was educated at Eton and later King's College, Cambridge, and in 1905 he became Provost of King's and was Vice-Chancellor of the University from 1913 to 1915, before returning to Eton as Provost in 1918. Very posh man. Most of his stories were written for friends or college magazines and include such subtle chillers as Lost Hearts, Canon Elbrick's Scrapbook, The Mezzotint, Casting the Runes, Count Magnus, and the classic Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which is very good. I've read that recently. His first collection was Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, 1904, followed by More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, A Thin Ghost and Others, and A Warning to the Curious, and the Collected Ghost Stories. An episode of Cathedral History originally appeared in the Cambridge Review before being included in James's third collection, published in 1919. Although it remains one of his less well-known tales, told in the author's usual understated style, James's wild-looking vampire is truly unnerving creation. There was once a learned gentleman who was deputed to examine and report upon the archives of the Cathedral of Southminster. The examination of these records demanded a considerable expenditure of time, hence it became advisable for him to engage lodgings in the city. For though the cathedral body were profuse in their offers of hospitality, Mr. Lake felt that he would prefer to be the master of his day. This was recognised as reasonable. The Dean eventually wrote advising Mr. Lake if he were not already suited to communicate with Mr. Warby, the principal verger, who occupied a house convenient to the church and was prepared to take in a quiet lodger for 3 or 4 weeks. Archives, I do say, yes. Such an arrangement was precisely what Mr. Lake desired. Terms were easily agreed upon, and early in December, like another Mr. Datchery, as he remarked to himself. This, if I remember, has a lot of references to, like, books written at the time, so occasionally he makes references to things that I've never read and don't know what they are. The investigation found himself in the occupation of a very comfortable room in an ancient and cathedral-y house. One so familiar with the customs of cathedral churches and treated with such obvious consideration by the dean and chapter of the cathedral in particular, could not fail to command the respect of the head verger. Mr. Warby even acquiesced to certain modifications of statements he had been accustomed to offer for years to parties of visitors. Mr. Lake, on his part, found the verger a very cheery companion and took advantage of any occasion that presented itself for enjoying his conversation when the day's work was over. One evening, about 9 o'clock, Mr. Warby knocked at his lodger's door. "I've occasion," he said, "to go across to the cathedral, Mr. Lake, and I think I've made you a promise when I did so. Next, I would give you the opportunity to see what it looked like at night time. It's quite fine and dry outside, if you care to come." "To be sure, I will, and much obliged to you, Mr. Warby, for thinking of it. But let me get my coat." "Here it is, sir, and I've another lantern here that you'll find advisable for the steps, as there's no moon." "Anyone might think we were Jasper and Durdles over again, mightn't they?" said Lake, as they crossed the close, for he had ascertained that the verger had read Edwin Drood. I do not know what Edwin Drood was. I did look up once, but I've definitely not read it. "Well, so they might," said Mr. Warby with a short laugh, "though I don't know whether we ought to take it as a compliment. Odd ways I often think they had at that cathedral. Don't it seem so to you, sir? Full choral matins at 7 o'clock in the morning all year round. Wouldn't suit our boys' voices nowadays, and there's 1 or 2 of the men would be applying for a rise if the chapter were to bring it in, particularly the altos." They were now at the southwest door. As Mr. Warby was unlocking it, Lake said, "Did you ever find anybody locked in here by accident?" "Twice I did. One was a drunken sailor. However he got in, I don't know. I suppose he went to sleep in the service, but by the time I got to him, he was praying fit to bring the roof in. Lord, what a noise that man did make. Said it was the first time he'd been inside a church for 10 years, and blessed if he'd ever try it again. The other was an old sheep. Them boys it was, up to their games. That was the last time they tried it on, though. There, sir, now you see what we look like. Our late dean used now and again to bring parties in, but he preferred a moonlight night. And there was a piece of verse he'd say to him relating to a Scotch cathedral, I understand, but I don't know. I almost think the effect's better when it's all dark-like. Seems to add to the size and height." What did you do with them? "Now, if you won't mind stopping somewhere in the nave while I go up into the choir where my business lays, you'll see what I mean." Accordingly, Lake waited, leaning against a pillar, and watched the light wavering along the length of the church and up the steps into the choir, until it was intercepted by some screen or other furniture, which only allowed the reflection to be seen on the piers and roof. Not many minutes passed before Warby reappeared at the door of the choir, and, by waving his lantern, signalled to Lake to rejoin him. "I suppose it is Warby, and not a substitute," thought Lake to himself as he walked up to the nave. There was, in fact, nothing untoward. Warby showed him the papers which had come to fetch out of the dean's stall, and asked him what he thought of the spectacle. Lake agreed that it was well worth seeing. "I suppose," he said as they walked towards the old steps together, "that you're too much used to going about here at night to feel nervous. But you must get a start every now and then, don't you, when the book falls down or a door swings to?" "No, Mr. Lake, I can't say I think much about noises, not nowadays. I'm much more afraid of finding an escape of gas or a burst in the stovepipes more than anything else. Still, there have been times years ago. Did you notice that plain altar tube there? 15th century we say it is, but I don't know if you agree to that. Well, if you didn't look at it, just come back and give it a glance if you'd be so good." It was on the north side of the choir, and rather awkwardly placed, only about 3 feet from the enclosing stone screen. Quite plain, as the verger said, but some ordinary stone panelling. A metal cross of some size on the northern side, that next to the screen, was the solitary feature of any interest. Lake agreed that it was not earlier than the Perpendicular period, but he said, "unless it's the tomb of some remarkable person, you'll forgive me for saying that I don't think it's particularly noteworthy." "Well, I can't say as it is the tomb of anybody noted in history," said Warby, who had a dry smile on his face, "for we don't own any record whatsoever who it was put up to. For all that, if you've half an hour to spare, sir, when we get back to the house, Mr. Lake, I could tell you a tale about that too. I won't begin on it now, it strikes cold here, and we don't want to be dawdling about all night." "Of course, I should like to hear it immensely." "Very well, sir, you shall. Now, if I might put a question to you, he went on as he passed down the choir roll. In our little local guide, and not only there, but in the little book on our cathedral in the series, you'll find it stated that this portion of the building is erected previous to the 12th century. Now, of course, I should be glad enough to take that view, but, mind the step there, sir, but I put it to you, does the layer of this stone here, in this portion of the wall, which he tapped with the key, does it to your eye carry the flavour of what you might call Saxon masonry? No, I thought not. No more does it to me. Now, if you'll believe me, I've said as much to those men, one's the librarian of our free library here, and the other came down for London on purpose 50 times if I have once. But I might just as well have talked to that bit of stonework. But there it is, everyone's got their opinions. Excuse me. The discussion of this peculiar trait of human nature occupied Mr. Warby up to the moment when he and Lake re-entered the former's house. The condition of the fire in Lake's sitting room led to a suggestion from Mr. Warby that they should finish the evening in his own parlour. We find them accordingly settled there for some short time afterwards. Mr. Warby made his story a long one, and I will not undertake to tell it wholly in his own words or in his own order. Lake committed to the substance of it to paper immediately after hearing it, together with some few passages of the narrative which had fixed themselves verbatim in his mind. I shall probably find it expedient to condense Lake's record to some extent. Mr. Warby was born, it appeared, about the year 1828. His father before him had been connected with the cathedral, and likewise his grandfather. One or both had been choristers, and in later life both had done work as mason and carpenter respectively about the fabric. Warby himself, though possessed, as he frankly acknowledged, of an indifferent voice, had been drafted into the choir at about 10 years of age. It was in 1840 that the wave of the Gothic revival smote the Cathedral of Southminster. There was a lot of lovely stuff went then, said Warby with a sigh. My father couldn't hardly believe it when he got his orders to clear out the choir. There was a new dean, just come in. Dean Burscough it was. And my father had just been apprenticed to a good firm of joiners in the city, and knew what good work was when he saw it. Cool it was, he used to say, all that beautiful wainscot oak, as good as the day it was put up, and garlands like of all foliage and fruit, and lovely old gilding work on the coats of arms and the organ pipes. All went to the timber yard, every bit, except for some little pieces worked up in the lady chapel and here in this overmantel. Well, I may be mistook, but I'll say our choir never looked as well since. Since there was a lot found out about the history of the church, and no doubt but what it did stand in good need of repair. There was very few winters passed but what we'd lose a pinnacle. Mr. Lake expressed his concurrence with Warby's view of restoration, but owns to a fear about this point lest the story proper should never be reached. Possibly this was perceptible in his manner. Warby hastened to reassure him. Not but what I could carry on about that topic for hours of time, and I do when I see my opportunity, but Dean Burscough was very set on the Gothic period, and nothing would serve him but everything must be made agreeable to that. And one morning after service he appointed for my father to meet him in the choir, and he came back after he'd taken off his robes in the vestry, and he got a roll of paper with him, and the vergy that was then brought to the table, and then he began spreading it out on the table with the prayer books, to keep it down, and my father helped him, and he saw in it was a picture of the inside of a choir in the cathedral, and the dean, he was a quick-spoken gentleman, he says, Well, Warby, what do you think of that? Why, says my father, I don't think I have the pleasure of knowing that view. Would that be Hereford Cathedral, Mr. Dean? No, Warby, says the dean. That's Southminster Cathedral, as we hope to see it before many years. Indeed, sir, says my father, and that was all he did say, leastways to the dean. But he used to tell me he felt really faint in himself when he looked round our choir, as I can remember it, all comfortable and furnished like, and then see this nasty little dry picture, as he called it, drawn out by some London architect. Well, there I am again, but you'll see what I mean if you look at this old view. Warby reached down a framed print from the wall. Well, the long and short of it was that the dean handed over to my father a copy of an order to the chapter that he was to clear out every bit of the choir, make a clean sweep ready for the new work that was being designed up in town, and he was to put it in hand as soon as ever he could get the breakers together. Now then, sir, if you look at that view, you'll see where the pulpit used to stand, and that's what I want you to notice, if you please. It was indeed easily seen, an unusually large structure of timber with a domed sounding board standing at the east end of the stalls on the north side of the choir, facing the bishop's throne. Warby proceeded to explain that during the alteration, services were held in the nave, and the members of the choir being thereby disappointed of an anticipated holiday, and the organist in particular incurring the suspicion of having wilfully damaged the mechanism of the temporary organ that was hired at considerable expense from London. The work of demolition began with the choir screens and organ loft, and proceeded gradually eastwards, disclosing, as Warby said, many interesting features of older work. While this was going on, the members of the chapter were naturally in and about the choir a great deal, and it soon became apparent to the elder Warby, who could not help overhearing some of their talk, that on the part of the senior canons especially, there must have been a good deal of disagreement before the policy being carried out had been adopted. Some were of the opinion that they should catch their death of cold in the return stalls, unprotected by a screen from the draughts in the nave, Others objected to being exposed to the view of the persons in the choir aisles, especially, they said, during the sermons, when they found it helpful to listen in a posture that was liable to misconstruction. The strongest opposition, however, came from the oldest of the body, who up to the last moment objected to the removal of the pulpit. "You ought not to touch it, Mr. Dean," he said, with great emphasis one morning when the two were standing before it. "You don't know what mischief you may do." "Mischief? It's not a work of any particular merit, Canon." "Don't call me Canon," said the man with great asperity. "That is, for 30 years I've been known as Dr. Aloff, and I shall be obliged, Mr. Dean, if you would kindly humour me in that matter. And as to the pulpit, which I've preached from for 30 years, though I don't insist on that, all I'll say is, I know you're doing it wrong in moving it." "But what sense could there be, my dear doctor, in leaving it where it is, when we're fitting up the rest of the choir in a totally different style? What reason can be given, apart from the look of the thing?" "Reason? Reason," said old Dr. Aloff. "If you young men, if I may say so without any disrespect, Mr. Dean, if you'd only listen to reason a little, and not always be asking for it, we should get on better. But there, I've had my say." The old gentleman hobbled off, and as it proved, never entered the cathedral again. The season, it was a hot summer, turned sickly on a sudden. Dr. Aloff was one of the first to go, with some affection of the muscles of the thorax, which took him painfully at night. And at many services the number of choirmen and boys was very thin. Meanwhile, the pulpit had been done away with. In fact, the sounding board, part of which still existed as a table in the summer house in the palace garden, was taken down within an hour or two of Dr. Aloff's protest. The removal of the base, not effected without considerable trouble, disclosed to view, greatly to the exultation of the restoring party, an altar tomb, the tomb, of course, to which Warby had attracted Lake's attention that same evening. Much fruitless research was expended in attempts to identify the occupant. From that day to this he has never had a name put to him. The structure had been most carefully boxed in under the pulpit base, so that such slight ornament as it possessed was not defaced. Only on the north side of it there was what looked like an injury, a gap between two slabs composing the side. It might be 2 or 3 inches across. Palmer, the mason, was directed to fill it up in a week's time, when he came to do other small jobs near that part of the choir. The season was undoubtedly a very trying one. Whether the church was built on a site that had once been a marsh, as was suggested, or for whatever reason, the residents in its immediate neighbourhood had, many of them, but little enjoyment of the exquisite sunny days and the calm nights of August and September. To several of the older people, Dr. Aloff among others, as we have seen, the summer proved downright fatal. But even among the younger, few escaped either a sojourn in bed for a matter of weeks, or at least a brooding sense of oppression, accompanied by hateful nightmares. Gradually there formulated itself a suspicion, which grew into a conviction, that the alterations in the cathedral had something to say in the matter. The widow of a former old verger, a pensioner of the chapter of Southminster, was visited by dreams, which she retailed to her friends, of a shape that slipped out of the little door of the south transept as the dark fell in, and flitted, taking a fresh direction every night about the close, disappearing for a while in house after house, and finally emerging again when the night sky was paling. She could see nothing of it, she said, but that it was a moving form, only she had an impression that when it returned to the church, as it seemed to do in the end of the dream, it turned its head, and then she could not tell why, but she thought it had red eyes. Warby remembered hearing the old lady tell this dream at a tea party in the house of the chapter clerk. Its recurrence might, perhaps, he said, be taken as a symptom of approaching illness. At any rate, before the end of September, the old lady was in her grave. The interest excited by the restoration of this great church was not confined to its own county. One day that summer, an FSA of some celebrity visited the place. I think that's Fellow of the Society of Antiquities? Antiquaries. His business was to write an account of the discoveries that had been made for the Society of Antiquaries. And his wife, who accompanied him, was to make a series of illustrative drawings for his report. In the morning, she employed herself in making a general sketch of the choir. In the afternoon, she devoted herself to details. She first drew the newly exposed altar tomb, and when that was finished, she called on her husband's attention to a beautiful piece of diaper ornament on the screen just behind it, which had, like the tomb itself, been completely concealed by the pulpit. Of course, he said, an illustration of that must be made. So she seated herself on the tomb and began a careful drawing which occupied her till dusk. Her husband had by this time finished his work of measuring and description, and they agreed that it was time to be getting back to their hotel. "You may as well brush my skirt, Frank," said the lady. "It must have got covered in dust, I'm sure." He obeyed dutifully, but after a moment he said, "I don't know whether you value this dress particularly, my dear, but I'm inclined to think it's in its best days. There's a great bit of it gone." "Gone? Where?" said she. "I don't know where it's gone, but it's off at the bottom edge behind here." She pulled it hastily into sight and was horrified to find a jagged tear extending some way into the substance of the stuff. Very much, she said, as if a dog had rent it away. The dress was in any case hopelessly spoilt, to her great vexation, and though they looked everywhere, the missing piece could not be found. There were many ways, they concluded, in which the injury might have come about. But the choir was full of old bits of woodwork, with nails sticking out of them. Finally, they could only suppose that one of these had caused the mischief, and that the workman who had been about all day had carried off that particular piece with the fragment of the dress still attached to it. It was about this time Warby thought that his little dog began to wear an anxious expression when the hour for it to be put into the shed in the backyard approached, for his mother had ordained that it must not sleep in the house. One evening, he said, when he was just going to pick it up and carry it out, it looked at him like a Christian and waved its hand, and I was going to say, well, you know how they do carry on sometimes. And the end of it was I put under my coat and idled it upstairs. I'm afraid I as good as deceived my poor mother on the subject. After that, the doctor acted very, very artful with hiding itself under the bed for half an hour or more before bedtime came, and we worked it so as mother never found out what we'd done. Of course, Warby was glad of its company anyhow, but more particularly when the nuisance that is still remembered in Southminster as the crying set in. Night after night, said Warby, that dog seemed to know it was coming. He'd creep out, he would, and he'd snuggle into bed and cuddle right up to me, shivering. Oh. And when the crying come, he'd be like a wild thing, shoving his head under my arm, and I was fully near as bad. 6 or 7 times we'd hear it, not more. And when he'd draw out his head again, I'd know it was over for that night. What was it like, sir? Well, I've never heard, but one thing that seemed to hit it off. I happened to be playing about in the close, and there was 2 of the canons met and said, good morning, one to another. Sleep well last night, says one. It was Mr. Henslow, that one, and Mr. Lyle was the other. Can't say I did, said Mr. Hyle. Rather too much of Isaiah... this is in Roman numerals. Isaiah 34, chapter 34, verse 14 for me. 34:13, says Mr. Henslow. What's that? You call yourself a Bible reader, says Mr. Lyle. Mr. Henslow, you must know. He was one of what used to be termed Simeon's lot, pretty much what you would call the evangelical party. You go and look it up. I wanted to know what he's getting at myself, so off I ran home and got out my own Bible, and there it was. The satyr shall cry to his fellow. Well, I thought, is that what we've been listening to these past 2 nights? I'll tell you, it made me look over my shoulder a time or two. Of course, I've asked my father and mother about what it could be before that, and they both said it was most likely cats, but they spoke very short, and I could see they were troubled. My word, that was a noise, hungry like, as if it were calling after someone that wouldn't come. If you ever felt you wanted company, it would be while you was waiting for it to begin again. I believe 2 or 3 nights there was men put to watch on different parts of the close, but they all used to get together in one corner, nearest they could to the high street, and nothing came of it. Well, the next thing was this. Me and another of the boys, he's in business in the city now as a grocer, like his father before him. We'd gone up in the choir after morning service was over, and we heard old Palmer the mason bellowing to some of his men. So we went nearer, because we knew he's a rusty old chap and there might be some fun going. It appears Palmer had told this man to stop up the chink in that old tomb. Well, there was this man keeping on saying he'd done the best he could. And there was Palmer carrying all possessed about it, like, call that making a job of it, he says. You had your rights, you get the sack for it. What do you suppose I'll pay your wages for? What do you suppose I'm going to say to the dean and chapter when he come round, as they may do at any one time, and see what you've been bungling about, covering the old place with mess and plaster and the Lord knows what? Well, master, I've done the best I could, says the man, but I don't know more than what you do, how it come to fall out this way. I tamped it right in the hole, he says, and now it's fell out, he says. I never see. Fell out, says old Palmer. Why, it's nowhere near the place. Blowed out, you mean? And he picked up a piece of plaster, and so did I, that was laying up against the screen, 3 or 4 feet off, and not dry yet. And old Palmer, he looked at me curious-like, and he turned around me and says, now then, you boys, have been up to some of your games here? No, I says, I haven't, Mr. Palmer. There's none of us been about here till just this minute. And while I was talking to the other boy, Evans, he got looking in through the chink, and I heard him drawing his breath when he came away sharp and up to us, and he says, I believe there's something in there. I saw something shiny. What? I dare say, says old Palmer. Well, I ain't got time to stop about there. You, William, you go off and get some more stuff and make a job of it this time. If not, there'll be trouble in my yard, he says. So the man, he went off, and Palmer too, and us boys stopped behind, and I says to Evans, did you really see anything in there? Yes, he says, I did indeed. So then I says, let's shove something in and stir it up. And we tried several bits of the wood that was laying about, but they were all too big. Then Evans, he had a sheet of music he brought with him, an anthem or a service, I forget which it is now, and he rolled it up, small, and shoved it in the chink. 2 or 3 times he did it, and nothing happened. Give it to me, boy, I said, and I had a try. No, nothing happened. Then, I don't know why I thought of it, I'm not sure, but I stooped down just opposite the chink, and I put 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled. You know the way. And that I seemed to think I heard something stirring. And I says to Evans, come away, I says, I don't like this. Oh, rot, he says, give me that roll. And he took it and he shoved it in. And I don't think I ever saw anyone go so pale as he did. I say, what? He says, it's caught, or else someone's got hold of it. Pull it out or leave it, I says. Come on, let's get off. So I gave it a good pull, and it came away. Leastways, most of it did, but the end was gone. Torn off it was, and Evans looked at it for a second, and then he gave a sort of croak and let it draw. And we both made off out of there as quick as ever we could. When we got outside, Evans says to me, did you see the end of that paper? No, I says, only it was torn. Yeah, it was, he says, but it was wet too, and black. Well, partly because of the fright we had, and partly because that music was wanted in a day or two, and we knew there'd be a set about with the organist. We didn't say nothing to anyone else, and I suppose the workmen they swept up the bit that was left along with the rest of the rubbish. But Evans, if you were to ask him this very day about it, he'd stick to it that he saw that paper wet and black on the end where it was torn. After that, the boys gave the choir a wild berth, so that Warby was not sure what was the result of the mason's renewed mending of the tune. Only he made out from fragments of conversation dropped by the workmen passing through the choir that some difficulty had been met with, and the governor, Mr. Palmer, to wit, had tried his own hand with the job. A little later, he'd happened to see Mr. Palmer himself knocking at the door of the deanery, being admitted by the butler. A day or so after that, he gathered from a remark his father let fall at breakfast, was that something a little out of the common was to be done in the cathedral after morning service on the morrow. And I'd just as soon it was today, his father added. I don't see the use of running risks. Father, I says, what are you going to do in the cathedral tomorrow? And he turned on me as savage as I ever see him. He was a wonderful good-tempered man, as a general thing, my poor father was. My lad, he says, I'll trouble you not to go picking up your elders. And betters talk. It's not manners and it's not straight. What I'm going to do, or not do, in the cathedral tomorrow is none of your business. And if I catch sight of you, hanging about the place tomorrow after your work's done, I'll send you home with a flea in your ear. Now you mind that. Of course, I said I was very sorry and all that. And equally, of course, I went off and laid my plans with Evans. We knew there was a stair up in the corner of the transept, which you can get up to the triforium. And in them days, the door to it was pretty well always open. And even if it wasn't, we always knew the key usually laid under a bit of matting hard by. Lad. Yeah. So we made up our minds we'd be putting away music and that next morning while the rest of the boys was clearing off, and then slip up the stairs and watch from the triforium if there was any signs of work going on. Well, that same night I dropped off to sleep as sound as a boy does, and all of a sudden the dog woke me up coming into the bed. And I thought, now we're going to get it sharp, for he seemed more frightened than usual. About 5 minutes sure enough came this cry. I can't give you no idea what it was like, and so near too, nearer than I'd heard it yet. And a funny thing, Mr. Lake, you know what a place this close is for an echo, in particular if you stand this side of it. Well, this cry never made no side of an echo at all, but as I said, it was dreadful near this light, and on top of the start I got with healing it, I got another fright, for I heard something rustling outside in the passage. Now to be sure I thought it was done, but I noticed the dog seemed to perk up a bit, and next there was someone whispered outside the door, and I very near laughed out loud, for I knew it was my father. My mother had got out of the bed with the noise. Whatever is it? Says my mother. Hush, don't know, says my father, excited like. Don't disturb the boy. Hope he didn't hear nothing. So me, knowing they were just outside, it made me bolder, and I slipped out of bed across to my little window, giving on the close. But the dog, he bored right down to the bottom of the bed, and I looked out. First go off, I couldn't see anything. Then, right down in the shadow under a buttress, I made out what I shall always say was 2 spots of red. A dull red it was. Nothing like a lamp or a fire, but just as so you could pick 'em out of the black shadow. I hadn't but just sighted them when it seemed we wasn't the only people who had been disturbed, because I see a window in a house on the left-hand side become lighted up, and the light moving. I just turned my head to make sure of it, and then looked back into the shadow for those 2 red things, and they were gone. And for all I peered about and stared, there was not a sign more of them. Then come my last fright that night. Something come against my bare leg. But that was all right. There was my little dog had come out of bed and prancing about making a great to-do, only holding his tongue, and me seeing he was quite in spirits again, I took him back to bed and we slept the night out. Sensible dog indeed. Next morning, I made out to tell my mother I'd had the dog in my room, and I was surprised. After all she'd said about it before, how quiet she took it. Did you? She says. Well, by good rights you ought to go without your breakfast to doing such a thing behind my back, but I don't know as there's any great harm done. Only another time you ask my permission, do you hear? A bit after that, I said something to my father about having heard cats again. Cats, he says. He looks over at my poor mother, and she coughed, and he says, Oh, yes, cats. I believe I heard them myself. That was a funny morning altogether. Nothing seemed to go right. The organist, he stopped in bed, and the minor canon, he forgot it was the 19th day, and he waited for the venite, and after a bit, the deputy set off playing the chant for evensong, which was a minor, and the Decani boys was laughing so much they couldn't sing. And when it came to the anthem, the solo boy got took with the giggles, and he made out his nose was bleeding, and shoved the book at me who hadn't practised the verse. And I wasn't much of a singer if I'd known it. Well, things was rougher, you see, 50 years ago, and I got a nip from the countertenor behind me that I remembered. So we got through somehow, and neither the men nor the boys went by way of waiting to see whether the canon in residence, Mr. Henslow it was, would come to the vestries and find him. But I don't believe he did, for one thing. I fancy he'd read the wrong lesson for the first time in his life, and he knew it. Anyhow, Evans as me didn't find no difficulty in slipping up the stairs, as I told you, and when we got up we laid ourselves flat down on our stomachs, where we could just stretch our heads over the old tomb. and we hadn't but just done so when we heard the verger. That was then. The verger that was then, first shutting the iron porch gates and locking the southwest door, and then the transept door, so we knew there was something up, and they meant to keep the public out for a bit. Next thing was the dean and the canon come in by their door on the north, and then I see my father, an old Palmer, and a couple of the best men, and Palmer stood talking for a bit with the dean in the middle of the choir. He had a coil of rope and the men had crows. That's crowbars, not the bird. I heard the dean say, "We'll have no time to waste, Palmer. If you think this will satisfy the Southminster people, I'll permit it to be done. But I must say this, never in the whole course of my life have I heard such arrant nonsense from a practical man as I have from you. Don't you agree with me, Henslow?" As far as I could hear, Mr. Henslow said something like, "Oh, well, we're told, aren't we, Mr. Dean, not to judge others?" And the dean, he gave a kind of sniff and walked straight back to the tomb, and he took his stand behind it with his back to the screen. And the others, they come edging up rather gingerly. Henslow, he stopped on the south side and scratched on his chin, he did, and the dean spoke up. "Palmer," he says, "which can you do easiest, get the slab off the top, or shift one of the side slabs?" Old Palmer and his men, they pottered about a bit, looking round the edge of the top slab and sounding the sides out on the south and east, and west, and everywhere but the north. Henslow said something about it being better to have a try at the south side, because there was more light and more room to move out in. Then my father, who'd been watching of them, went round to the north side and knelt down and felt the slab by the chink. And he got up and dusted his knees and he says to the dean, "Beg pardon, Mr. Dean, but I think if Mr. Palmer here will try the slab, we'll find it'll come out easy enough. Seems to me one of the men could prise it out with his crow by means of this chink." "Ah, thank you, Warby," says the dean. "That's a good suggestion. Palmer, let one of your men do that, will you?" So the man come round and he put his bar and he bore on it, and just that minute when we were all bending over and we boys got our heads well over the edge of the triforium, there came a most fearful crash down at the west end of the choir, as if a whole stack of big timber had fallen down a big flight of stairs. Well, you can't expect me to tell you everything that happened all in a minute. Of course there was a terrible commotion. I heard the slab fall out and the crowbar on the floor, and I heard the dean say, "Good God!" When I looked down again, I saw the dean tumbled over on the floor. The men was making off down the choir. Henslow was just going to help the dean up, and Palmer was going to stop the men, as he said afterwards, and my father was sitting on the altar step with his face in his hands. The dean, he was very cross. "I wish to goodness you'd look where you're coming to, Henslow," he said. "Why you should all take your heels when a stick of wood tumbles down, I can't imagine." And all Henslow could do, explaining he was right away on the other side of the tomb, would not satisfy him. Then Palmer came back, and reportedly there was nothing but to account for this noise, and nothing seemingly fallen down. And when the dean finished feeling of himself, they gathered round, except my father. He sat where he was, and someone lighted up a bit of candle, and they looked into the tomb. "Nothing there," says the dean. "What did I tell you? Stay, here's something. What's this? Bit of music paper, bit of torn stuff, out of a dress, it looks like. Both quite modern, no interest whatever. Another time, perhaps, you'll take the advice of an educated man," or something like that. And off he went, limping a bit, and out to the north door. Only, as he went, he called back angrily to Palmer for leaving the door standing open. Palmer called out, "Very sorry, sir," but he shrugged his shoulders, and Henslow says, "I fancy Mr. Dean's mistaken," and closed the door behind me, and he's a little upset. And Palmer says, "Why, where's Warby?" And they saw him sitting on the step and went up to him. He was recovering himself, it seemed, and wiping his forehead. And Palmer helped him up onto his legs, as I was glad to see. They were too far off for me to hear what they said, but my father pointed out to the north door in the aisle, and Palmer and Henslow, both of them, looked very surprised and scared. After a bit, my father and Henslow went out of the church, and the others made what haste they could and put the slab back and plaster it in. And about as the clock struck 12, the cathedral was opened again, and us boys made the best of our way home. I was in a great taking to know what it was had given my poor father such a turn. And when I got in, I found him sitting in his chair taking a glass of spirits, and my mother standing looking anxious at him. I couldn't keep from bursting out and making a confession where I'd been. But he didn't seem to take on, not in the way of losing his temper. "You was there, was you? Well, did you see it?" "I saw everything, father," I said, "except when the noise came." "Did you see what it was knocked the dean over?" he says. "The what come out of the monument?" "He didn't." "Well, that's a mercy." "Why, what was it, father?" I said. "Come, you must have seen it," he said. "Didn't you see? A thing like a man, all over hair with two great eyes to it." Well, that was all I could get out of him that time, and later on he seemed as if he was ashamed of being so frightened, and he used to put me off when I asked him about it. But years after, when I was got to be a grown man, we had more talk now and again on the matter, and he said the same thing. Black it was, he'd say, and a mass of hair and two legs and the light caught on its eyes. Well, that's the tale of that tomb, Mr. Lake, and it's one we don't often tell to our visitors. No, it's one we don't tell to our visitors, and I should be obliged to you not to make any use of it till I'm out of the way. I doubt Mr. Evans will feel the same as I do if you ask him. This proved to be the case, but over 20 years have passed by, and the grass is growing over both Warby and Evans, so Mr. Lake felt no difficulty about communicating his notes, taken in 1890, to me. And he accompanied them with a sketch of the tomb and a copy of the short inscription on the metal cross that was affixed at the expense of Dr. Lyell to the centre of the northern side. It was from the Vulgate of Isaiah 24, and consisted merely of 3 words: Ibi cubavit Lamia.